Hello and welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. Today I'm joined by Mark Meier. Mark is the Executive Director at Face It. He's worked in social work and has a master's degree in social work for the last 28 years. He founded Face It in 2009 with the goal of helping men understand and overcome depression. And this was partly based on his experience of depression firsthand. So Mark, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy to be lumped into the midlife. I feel like with each passing year, I'm getting closer to that other end of the spectrum.
So Mark, perhaps we could start by, maybe you could take us back to 2002, which is, I know, where really the story begins, and tell us what's happening then.
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks again for having me. I'm happy to share my story and my experiences. So, really, Philip, 2002, I would say, was the culmination of many years in the making of not dealing with my own mental health issues and battling, generalized anxiety and significant and severe depression, and certainly a very unhealthy relationship with alcohol at that time. And at that particular time in 2002, so I'm married. I have three adult children now, but back then I had three young children and I had an important job. I was the administrator of an inpatient kidney dialysis clinic at a hospital here in Minnesota. And my depression, my anxiety, my lack of self-care had completely spun out of control. And I found myself very acutely suicidal and had a suicide attempt, had intentions to end my life. And needless to say, I'm incredibly thankful and grateful that did not occur, and was hospitalized. And here in the US, I'm sure same in England, we had a process by which I went into the hospital against my will. I certainly didn't want to go, and I was committed. And that was a spot I would have never imagined finding myself in. And went into the hospital and was hospitalized for a couple of weeks and began this journey of recovery and beginning to better understand my own mental health, my depression, my anxiety, my behaviors, my attitudes, my beliefs. And, that is sort of where this particular story begins.
And, you said you had young children, you were married, you had a responsible job. So some people listening would think, why would Mark be thinking about trying to take his own life? What was going through your mind at that time, just to kind of help us understand the place that you were in?
Absolutely. I confirm everything those people may wonder myself. You look back and in retrospect with a clearer perspective, of course, it's an irrational place to be, but that's the nature of depression and anxiety and addiction issues, etc. But, what was going through my mind was I was an inept failure. In my mind, I was of no value to anyone. I carried around a deep-seated belief that actually these important people in my life would be better off without me, as though somehow I was the anchor and the albatross that was causing them their own difficulties. I think about some of the physical components. I could not sleep. I literally went a few months prior to going into the hospital essentially not sleeping. If I would get 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night, it was amazing, but it was chaotic, restless sleep. And so there was that. I just really felt like I was a burden. And of course, my own pain was such that I saw it as inescapable. I'll never feel better. There'll never be any joy in life. A dear friend of mine once described his depression as there was no color. Everything was gray. And, this notion of going through life with nothing but gray, it takes its toll. And the misery I felt was, how else do you describe it? Unless somebody's been there, it's off the charts. And again, I respect and understand to someone who doesn't, hasn't experienced or doesn't have the empathy to hear that depression, anxiety can do this. It doesn't make sense. There was literally nothing wrong in my life. I wasn't in debt. I wasn't going to lose my job. My wife loves me. My kids were good kids. It's the illness.
And you didn't want to share that with anyone? Did you feel that you just would deal with that yourself, and ultimately you decided to take the ultimate way out, I guess?
Yeah, it's this notion, and again, I think back on my own upbringing. We always want to, I wanted to make sense of what happened. If we want to trace this back to mom and dad, my parents were good people. My father was a military veteran, but he was kind, and he was, he didn't share emotions. He didn't have that capacity. But, I assumed I couldn't tell anyone. And, we grow with this notion of helping yourself and fixing yourself and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and all these sort of silly male beliefs that seem to, nobody ever really can point to where they heard them, but they yet perpetuate themselves, day in and day out. And this idea of sharing my struggles was just, and remember, you do the math on the time I went to into the hospital. I have a master's degree in social work. I kind of knew what was happening. But still, this idea of sharing it, somehow I was, and some of it is ego and arrogance. I was above it. If I just worked harder, if I just tried harder, I would overcome.
And that's interesting, isn't it? That you were trained and you're, I guess, working with identifying people with traits such as depression. But, they do say that it's quite difficult to diagnose yourself, isn't it? I mean, it's.
And my wife, who is a nurse, and we've been married for 32 years now. I mean, she's a wonderful person. She was so busy taking care of 3 kids. I mean, in retrospect, we've had multiple conversations about that time in our lives. And of course she saw it, but I mean, she had her own career. My children were 5, 3, and 9 months. I mean, they were young, and we were trying to pay the mortgage and keep the house going, all those things. And you just plod through, and then one day you can't.
So you were taken into the hospital, and I guess that was your tipping point, I guess. And so what happened then? How did you start on a recovery program?
Right. So yes, the hospital was absolutely, I can recall waking up a couple of days into this thinking, how in the hell did I end up here? Like, this is just not possible. And I do believe it was at that moment. And again, I have the benefit of looking back, so I don't want to create some story that, I have to be careful with what I recall. But I absolutely recall thinking, I am these folks, and that's okay. Like, I have some of the very same thing as these people who are surrounding me. And I'm not a particularly judgmental person. I'm very hard on myself and judge myself very harshly. But I think it was at that moment in time when I realized that, this is just something that can happen. And I certainly didn't embrace that fully, but I do recall thinking, okay, let's use these skills I have, which, I was an ice hockey player and I'm a very determined, persistent individual. Let's use those skills to figure out how to get better. And, again, this journey from 2002 continues to this very moment you and I are speaking. It's this understanding of caring for myself and managing my thoughts and certainly managing my behaviors and digging into some of the traumas and the things that I had experienced. And, the hospital stay was a couple of weeks. I started to take some medication at that time. I no longer take medication, but for that beginning part of the journey, the medication was a pretty important part. It really helped with some of the anxiety. I did an outpatient program where I was in that for 6 weeks, and then I started to do some individual therapy. And even that has been a little bit of fits and starts over all of these years with, doing some ongoing every now and again therapy sort of thing.
And it's interesting, and we've talked about this on this podcast before, this concept of the continuum of mental health, how, you're never fully recovered or fixed or cured. It's an ongoing process.
Right. And what I've discovered is that the acuity of it all, of course, it lessens. I mean, I have not thought about suicide in, let's say 22 years ago, I was in the hospital. I mean, I haven't thought about it as a way out in well over 15 years, but that was a hard fought journey. That initial phase of the recovery, if you will, was so much self-awareness and self-discovery. And not everything we discover about ourselves is great. And so there was some acceptance about who I am and how I behave and how I treated people. And I had to begin to understand that. But what I've noticed and what I really like to encourage men to understand, it's like anything we practice at. Generally speaking, if we put in some time and, healthy approaches to changing, we yield the benefits. And that's what I've noticed over all these years. I still struggle, but just not to the degree I used to.
So then move forward then to Face It, the organization that, you set up. Tell me how that came about then. And I would assume that was as a result of your experience.
It certainly was. And I have a very dear friend, Bill Deckis, who I approached and asked if he would want to undertake this with me. And we didn't really know what we were going to do. We just knew there was a way to help men. And what I really noticed while I was in the hospital was there is a tremendous amount of professional help, of very good, qualified psychologists and social workers and physicians and psychiatrists. And there's just this, this network. I mean, we could always use more of it. That's not but I mean, what I was really looking for was, where are the guys like me? Where are the men that have families and have careers and, are trying to, I don't know what the best language is here, but I was trying to change, and where were those guys? And I remember having a conversation with my psychiatrist, and of course he knew those people, but he couldn't connect me to them. We have guidelines and laws and confidentiality and all of those things. And so I had it in my head that I want to connect with men who I identify with. And I didn't even know what we were going to offer them, but that was really the advent of this. Is I wanted to sit with a guy and say, okay, you've got kids. How the heck do we talk to the kids about what we almost did? I could talk to a therapist about that, but it's not the same. It's not the same.
So you started the organization, and how did that, did you find that people were very receptive? Were you getting a lot of guys coming to you and saying, we've been looking for this?
Yeah, absolutely not. When we first started in 2009, I've been at this now long enough that I really do believe in my own head I've seen some changes in some of the stigma and the understanding. So we launched this thing back in 2009 here in the US, and did it we didn't know what to do. We're not the brightest businessmen. I mean, we're nice folks who want to help people, but we didn't know exactly what we were doing. And so we launched this thing by I climbed on a bicycle in San Francisco, and I rode my bicycle to New York City. And across the United States, we did presentations and we did talks, and we had this drivable camper thing that we had wrapped in men in depression and all these things, trying to spur conversations. And I would say we never really had any adverse interactions with folks, mostly curiosity. A lot of people asking about, well, what is men and depression, not as though they had no idea, but certainly not particularly attuned to the, maybe some of the unique needs of men. And as we made our way across country, what became very apparent to me was this notion that guys don't know where to go to talk. Like, therapy is a great thing, but for so many men, this idea of one-on-one behind a closed door, it just doesn't always fit. And so that became apparent to me. And we finished this cross-country bike ride and got back to our home here in Minneapolis. And we kind of Bill and I looked at one another and said, well, now what? And so I said, well, let's start a group. Let's start a peer group. And, one of the initial challenges is being clinically trained. This group that I started, it began to look like a therapy group at first, and that was not the goal. And Bill, who doesn't have clinical background, he said, he was in on the group with me, and he said, Mark, quit trying to teach these guys. Quit trying to, use the counseling approach, and let's just let them talk. And so, much to Bill's credit, I think the biggest part of our peer approach, meaning just sort of this general bringing men together and let them talk, that credit belongs to Bill. And quickly we grew over the next few years and added more and more groups. And today we have 23 men's groups. We have over 225 men who willingly, not court ordered, not the partner saying you better get help or you're out, that sort of thing. So it's grown over time, but it has taken time. That's for certain.
And even though, that stigma is starting to, dissipate, but it's still a massive problem, isn't it? I wonder if you can talk a bit about the size of that problem still, in 2024.
Yeah. My take on this, and I have a couple of stories, but the stigma part is real. But I have to say, Philip, I don't certainly hear some of the ignorant attitudes that I can recall from my older brother, who's 10 years older than I am, had some real challenges. So when I was a young child in the late 70s, early 80s, I can recall us doing some family therapy stuff. And I can recall some of the things that were said about my brother that I would characterize as, ignorant and harmful and dangerous. What I hear now is people saying, well, kind of what you said, gosh, that guy appears to be fine. How is it possible that he has these challenges? And so that's what I hear. And then what I really see and experience, and I've heard the story of thousands of men over the 15 years I've been doing this. What I continually hear is what I would lump together stigma and shame, and that shame piece being the part that I carried, meaning I can't tell anybody I'm broken. I can't tell anybody I need help because they'll think badly of me. Now, will they? I don't know. Maybe, probably, maybe not. I don't know. But that barrier, this perception, and I guess that's where stigma is real because perception matters, but that perception that I will be treated differently, I think it's still alive and well certainly in the United States workplace. I would imagine the same is true in England and many industrialized places where we fear not being able to get ahead. But even that I've noticed over time, workplaces are certainly giving more attention to addressing mental health needs in the workplace. I think they're still trying to figure out how to best do that. But I don't hear a tremendous amount of, well, it's not real. They're just faking. They're looking for attention. What the heck is their problem? I don't hear that stuff. I'm sure it is out there, but I just don't hear it like I think maybe I used to.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the reality is there are still, the suicide rates are still too high. And maybe, there are different ways, I guess, of reaching different men. So some guys are going to receive outreach through workplace programs, and some might kind of read up or listen to these sorts of podcasts. But there's still a whole heap of guys who aren't, reachable, I guess, who are still struggling with it. And that's partly what we're trying to do with this podcast. And I know that's what you're trying to do with the Face It organization as well. How do we get to those guys?
And the reach is, you and I are small entities that do the level best we are able to connect with people. And, we serve a metropolitan area of about 3 million people. And, we have 230. I mean, needless to say, there are a large number of people we could help. My take on all of it is just to keep talking, keep encouraging men. I'm not one to howl at society per se. I'm one to chase down a guy and say, hey, you shared with me what you're up to. Here's what I can encourage you to give consideration to. And I do think that helping men, I agree with the suicide rate. And I'm no expert in suicide. I think there are people who are bent on ending their lives that regardless of what we put in front of them, sometimes I think we are not going to save everyone. But I do believe, we've lost men to suicide. I mean, we've had men in our groups. And in fact, last fall, I had a very dear friend of mine who led one of our groups die by suicide. And I was texting with him the day before he died. I had no clue, none, and I don't know if it was an impulsive moment. He had hurt his back and had access to all sorts of significant pain medications. I don't know exactly. I've spoken subsequently with his wife and his sister and some folks, but I believe we keep talking. And I think that, when you record your podcast and if you get one person that hears this and whether it's them or someone they care about, just keep talking and keep encouraging people to seek out additional information.
So if you're listening to this and you feel like you're suffering from depression, maybe you haven't even translated how you feel as depression. Maybe it's actually something which is a bit more, intangible. But what would you say to those guys? What do you do to help yourself?
Right. You tell someone, and I don't know who that is for each person. I mean, I tell people this, and I literally get emails from all over the world because obviously you can Face It online. We have an email address, info@faceitfoundation.org. Tell me. I'm the one that'll receive that email. Tell me. I'll email with you. I'll talk to you. I've stayed up till 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning to connect with people all across this world. I'll be that set of ears that will hear you. But if you don't tell someone, you I'm sure can attest to this, and most of the listeners, you let your own brain be your guide when you're not in a good place. That's the least trusted guide out there. And that's what I did. I relied on the assumption that I could fix, I knew better. And you have to take a risk. I mean, nobody, man or woman, wants to be vulnerable. I understand that. And I certainly understand for men, this idea of being vulnerable is very frightening. But if you never share this, if you never let somebody into your life, the likelihood that this is magically going to cure itself is pretty low. And so you have to be willing to share with someone. And if I may, real quick, one of the things that I've heard over the years with the Face It guys, we'll get a guy in group and he'll say, there's nobody I can tell. Absolutely nobody. And we'll challenge that, or we'll say, there's no, anyway, you get to the punchline, meaning, yes, he finds someone. I would say to you, 99, I can think of one instance where this wasn't true, but 99% of the time, that guy will share with him. The guy will come back to group and say, yeah, the guy said I struggled too. I mean, this is part of the human condition, probably.
Yeah. And I guess sometimes it's not people you would expect to share things with. So, perhaps you've had friends since you were at school. And maybe, they're your closest friends, but maybe they're not the right people to talk to. I mean, how do you find the right person? I guess you don't know who it is, do you? But what would you advise in that scenario?
I think you do your best to just make a guess. And there's another thing too, that a lot of guys, I mean, I get it. In this moment of pain, suddenly we identify someone and we sort of vomit all of this information out. And then we're surprised that they give us that cross-eyed look. And, it turns out we were in the middle of a business meeting at 1:30 in the afternoon. I mean, time and place, right? So sometimes we have to give consideration. And I think you have to recall that sometimes, using my own story, Philip, after I got out of the hospital, my wife and my parents and the Minneapolis Police Department were the only people who knew that this guy needed to go to the hospital. And I kept that secret for 5 years because I was so ashamed. I mean, I understand sharing this is hard. We just, and when I did finally start telling, people just stared at me because they thought, like you said, married, kids, job, house, all these things. The guy's got everything. People are shocked, even though we know what happens. So, who do you tell? Well, and again, I don't know exactly what occurs in the UK, but I mean, here, I tell guys all the time, if you have a substance use issue, show up at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or a Narcotics Anonymous or a Sex Addicts Anonymous. I mean, any number of these meetings, you can be the fly on the wall and tell someone there who you may never see again. So give thought to, who do I tell? And I agree. I mean, I have advised men who say, well, I'm going to go to my boss and tell him everything. Well, maybe not right out of the gate. And that's not a shame thing. That's a protecting yourself in a vulnerable state thing.
I think there's perhaps, we perhaps need to reevaluate, if you're brave and you're strong enough to tell somebody how you're feeling, that's a sign of strength as opposed to a perception of weakness. And I think if we can change that perception, then that'll help, enormously, people to share how they feel, and it becomes normalized. And I guess if that message can get to kind of younger folks, then they kind of grow up with that perception. And I guess there's, that helps to further destigmatize, this whole concept of guys not talking about how they're feeling.
Absolutely. No, I think is such an important piece. And that's what we see at Face It. A guy will walk through the door on day one and overwhelmed and doesn't want to be vulnerable. And if that guy sticks around for any length of time, a month, 2 months, beyond, he begins to see that, oh my gosh, it's just so much smarter to share than it is to carry around these deep secrets and all this pain.
So for those people listening then who are married to or related to or work with or have friends who they think are depressed and not coping with it and hiding it, what advice would you have for them? How do you best approach that guy in order to so they can help themselves?
I think you let them know you care. I think you let them know you're concerned. I mean, that's the question I get all the time. And I certainly don't have the perfect response. Depends upon the guy. I mean, I've met a lot of men in my life who, being socialized as a men, we're competitive. We keep score. We do these things we do. And certainly women do those things too. I just spend a lot of time with guys that do that. I've had men where I'll challenge and say, gosh, you have all these important things and you want to get better. What can you do to take that on? What do you need to do? How do you talk to someone? How do I help you go forward? And you obviously do this in the context of caring. I tell guys all the time, there's nothing you're going to tell me that is going to change the way I feel about you. I mean, I'm here to help you. That's what I can offer you. And so I will walk with you. I think a lot of men are afraid that if I share with somebody, they're going to abandon me. They're going to leave me. They're going to think ill of me. And so if you are approaching somebody to help them, I think it is critical that you let them know you're here and, you will walk along with them, even when it is messy and it is difficult. I think, oftentimes we want to approach somebody and say, hey, you're struggling. And we have this great initial conversation. And then we sort of check the box of, well, I've helped that person. That's not how depression is. This is a tough nut to crack. And sometimes people need you to go that extra effort or make that extra effort and make a phone call to a counselor or a practitioner or someone. You need to walk with them. You need to help them through the process. It's not a one-off conversation. But I guess trying to summarize that, I think you let them know you care, you let them know you're going to be there, and you help them find resources.
I guess sometimes, the causes of depression are numerous, and many of them are out of your control, say if it's driven by debt or, an addiction to something like alcohol. And I guess you've already said, well, there are plenty of places you can go to, Alcoholics Anonymous, Gambling Anonymous. But sometimes that's quite a difficult step as well. And you can feel, I guess, very overwhelmed and, at the bottom of a well with no way out. So in that scenario, and I don't expect you to have, the miracle answer to this, but what do guys do then or anybody do when they just feel so overwhelmed and they think it might be out of proportion. It might not be. What are they going to do next?
Yeah. And that's really that's why I created Face It, because I wanted guys to know that there was a place where if you literally do not know what to do next, if you can somehow find us, we're the place that maybe fills that hole, that notion that I don't know what to do. I've had so many men show up at Face It and just look at me with that quizzical stare of, I'm not sure why I'm here, but here I am. And then from there, we can begin to dig in. And, that's one of the beauties of what we do at Face It, particularly in our healthcare environment. We don't charge. Every service we offer is free. And so if it takes us 6 months to get to something actionable that you can begin to deal with, we have the time, we have the energy, we have the space to do that. And we're not going to chase you away because of your inability to pay. But, if you don't know what else to do, call a hotline, do a Google search and type in, what the hell else should I do next? Yeah. I think do something. I sat this past Friday, I sat with a gentleman who's been coming to one of our groups for probably 3-4 years. And over the course of the last few months, his depression has returned and it's spiraled him to the point where he just lost his job because he was doing nothing. And he finally reached out to his group and was honest and told them what all had been happening. And so, they said, oh, you should just talk to Mark. So we sat down and talked. And, of course, he wanted to turn it into, I've failed epically and everything is horseshit and this is never, everything is bad. And I tried to help him reframe and see that this happens and you may have a chronic condition for which it returns. So let's start doing something. What's the next thing we can do? And what he walked away with is the next thing he's going to do is be honest about how he's using his time. And so it's a something. It's not going to fix his life. It's certainly not going to get his job back, but it's a something. And mental illness keeps us stuck. It keeps us stuck. And so how do you find that next one thing you can try? And I just so firmly believe if you have to step out onto the front porch and scream help, maybe that's what you have to do.
Well, we'll put the links and the links to Face It and a number, and maybe some other links on the podcast description. Mark, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, what a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for taking this on.
Well, you've been very open and honest. Thank you for that. And, and the advice you've given is brilliant. So thanks, Mark.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you. Get help. If you're a person listening to this, get some help.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you or someone you know is struggling with depression, the Face It organisation can be found at faceitfoundation.org, or you can email Mark at info@faceitfoundation.org. There are also organisations you can call now. For example, in the UK, you can call the Samaritans on 116 123. And if you're listening in the US, you can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you have a story to tell and you think your experience would help others, then please get in contact with me, either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Finally, Please share the podcast with people you know and with your networks. And if you enjoy listening, then please rate or like the podcast. It helps raise its profile and helps reach more people who might benefit from the stories shared by my guests.